Let's have a look at creating some objects inside this software. So an object is determined as anything that is created by the user inside the software. So we could go in and begin creating some basic polygon shapes. Here we've got a Polygon Sphere, and we can modify that sphere's scale. You can see that we have the scale being modified globally using the gimbal tool in the center. We could track just across the x-axis or the z-axis, and we will change those parameters in the channel box, or in the y-axis, or we can go back into the channel box and reset to a value of 1, which is the default for the creation of a polygon sphere. Now the sphere has some inputs going into it. It's a node-based system, so the sphere has been told it has some inputs in here, which are in the bottom. We have a radius, and if we middle mouse drag in the perspective view, we can see that the radius goes up and down. We have some subdivisions around the axis, so we can change how many times the axis has been subdivided, and we can also change how many subdivisions across the height. So if we were modeling a game object, we'd probably start with a sphere that's got 8 by 8 divisions across the axis and the height. So there are quite a few different primitives that we can bring in. We can bring in a cube, we can bring in a cylinder, we can bring in a cone, and these will all be given a certain shape name. And if we go to the outliner, we can see that these have all been given a P index at the front, and then that's denoting that it's a polygon, and then the word sphere. And if we had 2 of the spheres, we would then get sphere 2. If we duplicate with Control D, we would have sphere 3, etc. So it's a fairly simple way of creating some objects just by using the primitive shape toolset on the toolbar. These can be found in the Create menu. So you see we have a Create menu, and in here you have a few others. An interesting one is the helix, and this creates a spring-like shape. And if we go down to the inputs in the helix, you see we have quite a few more inputs in there. So we have number of coils, we have a height, we have a width, radius around the center point, we have a radius, so we can change the actual size of the radius. We have subdivisions across its axis, so the axis on this case would be around this axis here. We can go down into the subdivisions around the coil. So let's say we wanted to only have 20 in there. You can see we've changed the subdivisions on there. We can have subdivisions on the cap. As you can see, the cap's getting a subdivision, and so on. So lots of inputs being put into this, and allows us to change either the transform node or into the input shape node. So let's have a look at what this looks like in a graph form. Okay, to look at this in a graph form, what I've done is I've opened up the hypergraph window. I'm going to select the helix shape, and by selecting the helix shape you can see it becomes selected inside the hypergraph, and then I'm going to show the input connections and the output connections. So this is just focusing now on the connections that go into this helix. So right now we have an initial shading under the attribute editor. We have an initial shading group. That's what this is. So this is the initial shading group, and in there we have the shading group material. Source material is a Lambert 1, and then we have the properties, which is spread across all of those. So if I selected a couple of these objects, I showed the input graph, you can see that they're all going into the input, the initial shading group input node. If I just have one selected, then you can see, then we can go back. Then we have the shape node. So the shape node in here is showing the tessellation attributes, the mesh component displays, the mesh controls, the tangent space, the smooth mesh preview that's on there, so we can hit the smooth mesh preview. This can also be accessed by pressing 2 on the keyboard. So if ever you accidentally press 2 or 3 on the keyboard, you'll see that you get 2 will give you a cage and smooth mesh, and 3 will give you just the smooth mesh preview. Turn that off. So if ever you wonder why your cube, for instance, has gone into the shape of a ball, and that's what you've pressed number 3 on the keyboard. So there's the helix shape, and this is the helix shape, and then we have the helix itself, and this is the very first input. This is the input node that tells us how many coils we're going to have, how much height, how much width, how many radii the radius is on the actual coil itself. So, and whether we've got a rounded cap or whether we've got a finished cap. So you can see we have quite a few options that are not in the channel box when we go into there. So that's what an object. That's what we mean by objects. And we can have many objects. So we can have curves. These can be objects. So we can put in a curve. Okay, and if we were to press the input and output on a curve, you can see the curve has the curve shape in there. There's the shape node and there's the curve node, and the curve is a transform node, so that's the transform node. This is what this is, and then the shape node is telling us the components about what how we see this. So we could say we want to display the CVs or the edit points or the hull, and these can all be turned on or off, and this is where they go in. We could also use a NURB surface, a non-uniform rational B-spline surface. So if I had 2 curves together, I've duplicated it, so I've got 2 curves. I select these 2 curves, I could have a loft between these 2 curves. That would create this shape node in here of a non-uniform rational B-spline, and we could choose whether we're using a linear shape or we're using a cubic shape. And it's when we see how these shape nodes are actually put together, because they're connected, the loft here, this is the loft shape, is connected via these shape nodes. When we modify these shape nodes, we're actually modifying the loft parameters as well. So there's some connected history in there, and you can see the pink lines denote that there is a connection there to this surface that we've got in there. So that's creating objects. So you can create quite a few objects, and we're starting to get into component nodes, and we'll cover that in a bit more depth in the next session.